getting synthetics out there, Thor names out there, what we call light nodes or yig nodes out there. We got more things kind of planned, but we've been really excited to change our posture from a defensive one, which we would sit standing in for the last couple months, trying to shore up some things and get as many people as we can from the communities to audit, investigate, look into more eyes on the code as possible. The more, the better. And now we're starting to shift our position back towards an offensive position of trying to, add more features and kind of step the protocol forward.
You just mentioned
Does that mean no contract calls other than ERC20 contract calls? Because aren't those contract calls even just a simple ERC20 send?
Well, no. So that's okay, of course. It's more of a contract calls from outside of those, in a sense, calling them.
I see. Okay, that makes sense.
Because technically, when you're sending it, in ERC20, you're interacting with that particular smart contract, right? In a sense. So yeah, I think it's right now it's like a waitlisted list of smart contracts that are allowed to interact. To that's my knowledge. I think the only one is like an X rune is the only one that's allowed currently right now. We got to figure out from a governance perspective of how to move that forward going forward, or maybe just remove it entirely if we feel so inclined. As a later community might decide to do. It's up to people down the stream to make the determination themselves. But yeah, I think that the point was to come to a much more defensive place and a more defensible place as quickly as we could to ensure the security of all assets.
That's awesome. You had mentioned 4 features that currently are not enabled on THORChain, and I'd love to dive into each of these 4 in whatever order you prefer. You mentioned Thor names, you mentioned Thor you mentioned synthetics, and I'm drawing a blank on the 4th. But all these are upcoming features of THORChain. I know that I'm fascinated to learn more about them, and I'm sure the 98 folks in our audience want to listen to it as well. So can you dive into any of these?
Of course. So the first one that's probably going to come out first is synthetics. Synthetics is basically we're minting an asset on the THORChain blockchain that represents a one-to-one relationship to the value of the underlying synthetic. So like say you use synthetic Bitcoin, for example. That synthetic Bitcoin is backed by the pool itself, right? That's not a wrapped asset or a pegged asset. That's different. Wrapped or pegged assets is like a one-to-one ratio. I give you 1 Bitcoin, and the Bitcoin blockchain, and then WBC or something like that mints a WBDC asset on the Bitcoin on the Ethereum blockchain. This is a little bit different actually, because you're technically the collateral is not, instead of solely being the asset, it's actually a collection of 2 assets. In this case, it'd be Bitcoin and Rune. So you're actually backed by the pool itself. That can be secured economically because of the Rune asset. You can't have an asset be you can't have a detachment or decoupling between the asset that is securing the network and the asset that it is protecting. If you have those detachment and their economic value, one of the security can be valued a lot less than the assets that is protecting, and then it becomes, well, somebody can sub-attack you and take all the funds and walk away a very wealthy individual. You certainly don't want that. But a synthetic actually allows this because because it's partially backed by Rune, it moves with Rune, which is a really important thing from a security perspective. So synthetics is basically allowing you synthetic Bitcoin, synthetic Ethereum, synthetic USDT, synthetic whatever asset you want on the THORChain blockchain. In some ways, you can consider it to be kind of like a lightning network-like effect, in the sense that it's very fast resolution, 5-second block times, and very cheap, like pennies, to actually send synthetic Bitcoin from one person to another instead of waiting 10 minutes or paying $5 in fees. It's much faster and more efficient in that sense. That's nice. But the other thing that's really good about it is that it allows you to arbitrage the pools much more efficiently. So now an arbitrage bot can arbitrage the Bitcoin pool without needing to touch the layer 1 Bitcoin underneath it all. You can actually correct the pool price surely with Rune or with synthetic Bitcoin. And what that means is it's a lot faster, a lot cheaper, a lot more efficient for our bots to operate. And they can arbitrage pools much quicker than what the Bitcoin blockchain could possibly allow. You can imagine if the Bitcoin price moves very quickly in a very short period of time, and it takes 10 minutes to actually, make a transaction to correct that pool price, that might be problematic possibly, right? So this will allow you to basically arbitrage any pool within 5 seconds, which is really good. Once you have synthetics, you can go
Hold
to
Chad, is that the only reason why you would want to create a synthetic, just so you can trade in and out of that asset more quickly? Or is there another reason why you would want to use these synthetics?
Yeah, they become a building block. It's almost like a fundamental layer of the network that allows you to build more THORFi features on top of it, right? So, for example, one of the things I'm really excited about is what we call Thor Savings, or another way of calling it is yield-bearing synthetics. And so what that allows us to do, which you can't do with the layer one objects, is that you can actually have a fixed rate income on any asset of your choosing. So it's BYOA, bring your own asset, and earn probably up to 20% fixed rate interest on your Bitcoin, or on your Tether, or on your BNB.
Or on your Fox, perhaps.
Or on your Fox, perhaps, yes, any asset at all. It's very similar to Anchor's 20% fixed rate interest that they're doing over at Terra. But instead of being just their asset of UST, which is a great stablecoin, by the way, this one, it can be applied to any asset of your choosing. And that's actually really important because one of the things that makes THORChain very differently than almost every project out there in the space is that we're not trying to convince people to like come to us and think that we are the most amazing thing in the world and all these things. We're actually coming to other people's ecosystem and saying we're supporting you, right? So you don't have to convince a Doge fan, for example, that Rune is the best thing ever and all this stuff. You can just say, hey, Doge person, do you like to earn more Doge? Great, here you go. It's a much easier sell than trying to convince a Doge person that Rune is the best thing since sliced bread or whatever. You can just convince them, hey, you can earn more Doge on your Doge over here, right? 20% fixed rate interest, like something like this. That's an easy sell, right? And that can spread this project through the ecosystem pretty fast once we get fully ramped up and running.
Hey, Chad, I have a question for you. So these THORFi synthetics are super interesting, and my mind is not fully around them yet. But
yeah,
one thing I'm struggling with is you create a synthetic Bitcoin, and what is ultimately backing it is a combination of Rune and Bitcoin in the pools, right?
Yep.
Okay, so how do you back Bitcoin correctly or sufficiently when half of the backing is a totally different asset?
In terms of ensuring
is it just over collateralized to a large degree?
It's actually not over collateralized in the way that we would think about that term. Effectively, what happens is, if you want to get into the nitty gritty of it, the techniques of it, effectively what happens is, say you want to take your real Bitcoin and you want to get a synthetic Bitcoin on the other side. Technically, what's actually happening is you're swapping your Bitcoin for Rune, and then you're swapping that Rune into you're minting a synthetic coin minus the swap fees, of course. So there's a little bit less of the fees. If you got one Bitcoin, you're not getting one Bitcoin on the side. You're getting one Bitcoin minus whatever the fees were, which should be pretty minimal, probably, depending on the depth of the pool. But and then what's happening is the network kind of tracks how much Rune is required, how much of the pool, but actually not much Rune, how much of the pool is required to back that that synthetic Bitcoin and everybody else's synthetic Bitcoins that exist. And so it dynamically calculates the number of LP units that's required, and it kind of carves out part of the pool and to get to back that system up, back up the synthetics up. And so what ends up happening is the synthetic units, which are dynamically calculated moment to moment, block to block, of however many units is required to maintain enough value to support one Bitcoin to one synthetic Bitcoin to one Bitcoin. It actually forgoes any gains. You're providing Rune to the system and to the pool, right, or your capital into this pool, and any yield or any gain or losses that happens does not go to you because you're just holding the asset. You're getting that single asset exposure of just that synthetic Bitcoin. You're not getting you're not being exposed to the movements of Rune, for example, in a sense.
Okay.
And so what ends up happening is
helps.
any gains losses you have actually gets pushed off onto the LPers. So that actually leverages the LPers, right? So even though the pool is, let's say, $1 million, the LPers might only be contributing 700,000 of that $1 million, and so but they're gaining the wealth as if they provided the full million in a sense, right? So it actually leverages the LPs, and they actually make more money or more losses depending upon the movement of impermanent loss and all these things. But it's basically a leveraging effect. But the network always carves out exactly how much is needed to make sure that we always have enough assets put aside in a sense to ensure that no matter what the price of Rune is, whether it goes way up high or way down low, doesn't matter. The network will always make sure that it has enough Rune and enough Bitcoin to be able to support that synthetic Bitcoin in a sense.
Is it true then that the essential soundness of it comes from the fact that to create a synthetic Bitcoin requires the deposit of a real Bitcoin at some point in the past, and so there is no synthetic Bitcoin that didn't get a real Bitcoin? Is that statement true?
That's partially true. So you can mint a synthetic Bitcoin just by providing Rune, right? And effectively, what actually happens is you're adding just Rune onto the pool, and the pool becomes imbalanced. And so then you have this problem of, okay, the pool price is incorrect. So arbitrage bots will come in and send in real Bitcoin, right? And take out Rune on the other side. So if you don't provide the Bitcoin, the arbitrage bots will.
Okay, so then that statement might still be true, assuming the arbitrage bot would deposit the Bitcoin. But I guess then it means that Bitcoin might be deposited later, not ahead of the creation of the synthetic.
Yeah, it might get created up to 10 minutes later, depending on Bitcoin's case, because it's block time. But it eventually gets there. The price will be corrected, and when it does, if you got one synthetic Bitcoin, approximately half of Bitcoin gets put into it, and you supply the other half of Rune.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, please finish your thought, Chad.
No, I was going to say that becomes the building block to create a synthetic asset instead of a wrapped asset that you can then use that asset to do all sorts of interesting THORFi features and trading and derivatives and whatever else you want to throw on top of it. And then we can also beam those synthetics off in the Cosmos ecosystem, beam them out to other Cosmos chains or even non-Cosmos chains. Technically, you can beam it to like Polkadot or something like this. That's technically possible as well. So we can become the entry and the exit point of the greater crypto sphere into the Cosmos ecosystem, potentially.
That's awesome. I'm really glad that you dove into synthetics, because I got to admit, something never sat well with me when I heard that synthetics were coming, and I definitely didn't have as much background information about it as I do now, thanks to listening to you. But for a system that was all built on layer one, non-wrapped coins, why the heck was THORChain thinking of using synthetics? But your explanation makes perfect sense. It allows for swaps to be done significantly faster, allowing ARBs to work it out, and cheaper. And it also enables these cross-chain IBC connections to the rest of the Cosmos ecosystem. This all makes sense. Thank you very much for that explanation.
Yeah, I think the important thing people should remember is that these synthetics are not forced upon you, right? You can choose to use them if you want to choose to use them, or if you want to transact just in layer ones, that's fine too. The important thing is having the advantage of choice to decide for yourself what you want to do with them. But like, there's use cases where you'd want to use a layer one, and there's use cases where you would not want to use a layer one, right? There are, depending on what you're trying to achieve, what you're trying to accomplish, you have these trade-offs of, okay, you have less security typically with like wrapped or synthetics in general, because you're taking on additional risk in doing so. But then you have access to do, more DeFi protocols and more access to do more vesting opportunities and these things. And so like, there's a trade-off here, and everybody can make their own decision for themselves of what that trade-off is and how, if it's valuable enough or not, if the ROI is worth the additional risks that come with it. Everybody can make that choice for themselves and, transact if they want to. But the important thing is that like you can make the choice and say, I just want to hold layer 1 Bitcoin, or I want to hold layer 1 Ethereum, or layer 1 whatever. Or I can say, I want to get involved into the Cosmos system because there's some really cool, apps being built that I want to participate in, and I want to use Bitcoin as my collateral to do, perpetual trading, for example, or casinos, like whatever you want to do, right? It doesn't matter.
Great. And correct me if I'm wrong, Chad, but these synthetics this is part of the THORChain ecosystem that will in theory end up being IBC enabled. Is that true? Like you'll be able to send these synthetics like into Osmosis or to other chains?
Yes, that's the goal. That's what we're thinking. Nine Realms team is taking on the work to build that IBC bridge between THORChain and the rest of the sphere. I don't know when that's going to be done per se. Technically, synthetic is already deployed in the blockchain today. Now, it's just feature flagged off in the moment, so it can be flipped on any moment per se. I think we're just waiting until we kind of get through these chain restarts and get everything's back up and running, and do a raise the caps, do a churn, make sure everything is valid, everything's running, everything's smooth, everything's going well, and then we can start pushing synthetics on and Thor names and yield bearing synthetics and other things we have planned.
Yeah, very cool. Obviously, the just getting the chain up and operating in that fundamental building block of cross-chain exchange is the most important thing right now. So I'm glad you all are taking your time with that.
Yeah.
I'd love to move on to a different subject that Michael brought up earlier, and that's one that I'm particularly excited about, which is this concept. And I think this is another great thing that we will very much want to look at integrating into ShapeShift via the DAO, is this concept of THORFi. And in particular, I've really been, ever since this was announced, many months ago, and you all were working on this idea of being able to, lend your native Bitcoin and use it as collateral to borrow against is something that I've been very interested in. And I'd love for you to just go a little bit more into like what the vision is for THORFi, how far away that might be, and, where do you see that going?
Yeah, that's a really big feature we have planned. That's going to be, I think that's going to be ginormous. I mean, being able to get layer 1 loans of like Bitcoin, for example, is like huge. I mean, DAI exists. I mean, DAI pretty much exists to allow people to 3x long their position on Ethereum, right? You take your Ethereum, you mint some DAI, you swap it for Ethereum, you mint some more DAI, swap it for Ethereum, make one DAI. You do this 3 times, you can 3x long your position, right? On Ethereum. That's probably the number 1 use case for that purpose. But imagine we could do that with Bitcoin. Like that would be huge. How many people would actually be interested in taking a 3x long position on Bitcoin? Probably a lot more than Ethereum. That's kind of safe to say, just because it's such a larger asset, obviously. What's interesting? It was interesting in our case. We're kind of borrowing a page from the Alchemix crew around. You can provide capital into a pool, which is a yield bearing. And then that yield can be used to pay off your loan for you. So if you take out a Bitcoin loan, for example, a layer 1 Bitcoin loan, there's a high likelihood that you'll never have to pay back that loan ever, because the collateral that you're using is paying it back for you on your behalf without you needing to do pretty much anything. That's pretty cool. That's pretty important. And it's kind of fascinating because really what's happening there, if you think it through, which is that you're basically taking the interest that you will be making with your collateral, and you're taking it out now versus getting it as it comes in over the next 3 months or 6 months, depending upon your loan size and all that kind of stuff. And you're just basically kind of getting your yield today instead of waiting 6 months for it or waiting 3 months for it, whatever the number is, and then being able to take that yield and do what you want with it. You could 3x long your position. You could help to buy a house. I mean, whatever you want to do with it, you can do with it. It's up to you. But I think that's going to be a really kind of a game-changing feature. I think this is the thing I don't think people are quite realizing yet, is that like how valuable is something like an Aave or a Compound going to be once you can do what they do for basically cheaper, lower interest rates, and there's a reason why we can have lower interest rates than them, and you can do it cross-chain for basically any asset that you could theoretically want. Like that, it becomes like the argument, like, well, why would you use Aave? Like maybe you'd use it for some long tail assets, like some really small cap ERC20s possibly, but then nobody really uses Aave for small cap, obviously, or compound. They don't have that many assets on their docket per se. So it's gonna. I don't see a reasonable reason to use Aave if you could do the same thing with THORChain, cross-chain, pay back your loans for you, and, and the interest rate is less.
Hearing this makes me look at the current price of Rune and realize that the stuff that you were just talking about, the THORFi, the loans, the Alchemix-like self-repayability, I don't think the market has priced all this in yet.
No. Most people don't even know we're even thinking about those things, to be honest with you. It's funny, like yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I'll ask after.
No, I was going to say, like, it was funny because I went to a few conferences recently and I met a bunch of people, and I was actually surprised how many people didn't know what THORChain was at all. I actually was a bit surprised about that. So it goes to show how many people have no idea about the the lending and the THORFi features and all this stuff, but they have actually no idea THORChain even exists at all. so the price of Rune has not fully baked in in some sense, right? There's a lot of people who don't know a lot of things about this project, and so maybe they'll waken up to it at some point. At least I hope so. We'll see how that happens.
My question was, do you believe necessarily that the loan through THORFi would be at a lower interest rate?
Sorry, so they're going to hear.
Why do you say necessarily that the interest rate through a THORFi loan would be lower?
Oh yeah, so the reason why that is because when you have an interest rate on Aave or Compound, the interest rate largely compiles based upon how much of the asset that you're loaning out they have remaining, right? And so they only have so much, ETH, for example, and they can't just put like a 1% on that, because I know there'd be like basically like a bank run on it, and so they would just all go to leave the system. And so instead of like the less and less ETH they have in the system, the higher the interest rate goes, right? And it's kind of creates this capitalistic system of providing liquidity and lending that liquidity on both sides. And so they have a variable rate interest rate, and that can really fuck with you, because like you could just take the loan out for today at 12% and then come back tomorrow and it's all of a sudden at 22%. Like that can happen and does happen, which is kind of hard because you don't know what you're going to owe back in the end. I think what's different about THORChain is because it has an AMM built into it as well. When we loan out layer 1 Bitcoin, that layer 1 Bitcoin comes right back into the system via arbitrage opportunities, right? And so like we send them, Eric Voorhees a loan of 1 Bitcoin, whatever, and then moments later the Bitcoin comes right back into the system. So we always have the correct amount of Bitcoin that we need because the arbitrage bot's always insured, right? Because of that, we can do things that they can't do. For example, we were talking before, and none of this lending stuff is like hard and fast, because we still need to work out some of the mathematics of it all. But one of the things we were talking about doing was doing fixed rate interest rates on lending instead of variable rate. And so you can take out a loan at a specific interest rate, and then you get locked into that interest rate until it's paid back, instead of being changed underneath your feet along the way. That's a much more reliable system. And like, again, the reason why we can do that is because we basically have access to as much Bitcoin as we need to give out as many loans as we want, because arbitrage plots will always give it back to the system once we lend it out.
Super interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is like the really important thing. This I think is going to be what DeFi 2.0 is going to be all about. Like once we people start talking about that as if it's going to be protocol own liquidity, which I personally disagree with that mentality. I think it's going to be when you give liquidity into a single system, and that system has multiple inputs of revenue, and like supercharges the yield in a very sustainable and reasonable way. Like that's going to be DeFi 2.0, about not having isolated liquidity that is for one specific use case or purpose, but yet having a whole pool liquidity that you can put your Bitcoin into. And then you can earn yield from the block rewards, from the swaps that's happening to the network, from the fixed rate interest interest on the synthetics, from the lending, from the all the different DeFi protocols that are being built on THORChain. They're all going to be, each one of them has their own source of income, and therefore being put onto the same individuals who provide liquidity into that Bitcoin pool, for example. And then that just supercharges the hell out of their return, and they're completely sustainable, non-bullshit kind of way, which we see commonly in the space of, we can get 300% APY. It's like, can I? Probably not. But in this case, because the revenue is coming from multiple sources, every source, in fact, it's just dumping into a one pool, which you're getting a share of that, depending upon how much of that pool you actually own, relative to how much liquidity you provided to that system. That's what I think DeFi 2.0 is going to be all about, is actually supercharging yield via multiple income streams. And anybody who does that well will probably have much higher yield than a compound or a finance or a single income stream protocol can possibly compete against. And so that just becomes the obvious thing to do, of you provide liquidity into things that gives you much higher yield in a sustainable way than the one that gives you much less yield in a sustainable way. That's going to be a no-brainer. That's going to destroy everything else in the current space.
Follow up for this THORFi topic. From the stage chat, Uncle Badgers asks about THORFi 2. So Ohm and Spell and token models. Will THORChain have anything similar to these models with its THORFi, or will that be left for some future upgrade?
Yeah, we've been talking about this POL issue and trying to figure out a way to make it work. It's much harder for THORChain to do this protocol Own Liquidity. And for somebody who doesn't know what that is, it basically means that the protocol itself becomes an LPer in its own system, and it just constantly just adds more and more funds into its liquidity, its position, deepening, forever deepening the pools. That's the concept behind it, and that's the value of it. Is you kind of create this flywheel of deeper and deeper pools, which is great. Because in THORChain's case, the deeper the pool is, the less the fees are, and it becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to trade on THORChain with no real limit to that. The problem with that, though, for THORChain's case, is that unlike Ohm, THORChain needs to scale its security along with its pools. So you can't just have a flywheel on the pool side, just putting in billions of dollars and not scale the security side as well. And how we kind of maintain that relationship between them so they all kind of scale up together is something called the incentive pendulum, and just pushes yield towards one side or the other, depending upon how it needs to balance the system in that moment. That kind of requires, or at least assumes, that that people who are participating in both sides of that equation are rational, people who want to earn more yield, right? And so you're making less money on the pool side, so you're going to move your liquidity to the bond side, to the security of the network, or vice versa. But a POL is not a rational actor, right? It's not actually any interest in doing anything other than just growing itself like a black hole kind of thing. And so it's an irrational actor in an incentive pendulum scenario, which is not necessarily a good thing. If you think about it, kind of draw it out over time, what the likely outcome is that the POL will basically grow its own position higher and higher and higher, meaning the yield will be lower and lower for everybody else, because the incentive pendulum starts putting more and more yield towards the bond side, the security side. And then eventually all the people that are providing liquidity in the pools, they basically walk away, because it's like, well, I'm only getting 2% yield here. I'm only getting 1% yield. I'm getting 0% yield. Why am I going to provide my Bitcoin in this pool? This is stupid. And they leave the system forever, right? More or less. So that becomes, the POL becomes a sole provider of liquidity on the pool side, and humans are the providers of Rune on the bond side. And that becomes that kind of breaks the model, the economic model to some regard. Now, if you're Own, you don't have to do this, because you're running on Ethereum, and you don't need to worry about security at all. You're just using the shared security of the entire network itself. You're kind of offset and give that work to somebody else, which is Ethereum in this case. And so you can just grow like a flywheel all the way up, doesn't matter. You can do that all day. So we have a different economic imperatives that make it more difficult to implement this concept. And we haven't been able to figure out a way to do this in a way that maintains that flywheel mentality. Everything we've thought of so far would create more of like a rusty wheel mentality where it kind of turns on for a little while, then it turns off, then it turns on and off, depending upon the security of the network. But that's not quite the motivation or the movement we want to see. So we haven't been able to figure out a way to implement this in a way that economically makes sense for the protocol. Maybe we'll figure it out downstream at some point. I'm hopeful we will, but still questionable.
Great.
Wow, this is a lot to take in.
Yeah, there's so much here. We could almost spend an hour on each of these mini topics.
Probably could. You probably could. I could probably talk for many hours on each one of these things.
And I'm sure that we'll ask you to come back, Chad, because clearly this is popular with the community. We've got over 120 people listening right now. And I'd love to get to some. I want to make sure that with this time that we get to some community questions.
Sure.
So if anyone in the community has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. We have at least one person who I'm inviting up to stage. And also, if you post your questions in stage chat, we are happy to read those aloud for you. FinBlue, you've had your hand raised for a while, though, so I'd love for you to go ahead, and then DeFi Cafe, who just hopped on stage.
Just had a quick question. There was some discussion on the Dev Discord today about a potential vulnerability that was mentioned in July that might have been overlooked just due to the insanity of that time. And then today, I guess somebody else mentioned that there was an 11th hour white hack vulnerability submission that might delay the relaunch of the ETH chain. And I was just curious if those two are related or if there's any commentary you can share, or if it's just too early at this time. And really appreciate what you guys are doing.
Yeah, sure. So the first part of your question about a guy from a message, I think his name is Bog Hodler or whatever it is. He actually CC'd me in a message like back in July. I guess I just missed it. I don't remember ever seeing it. But that was like a crazy time when I was just like working all hours every day and like tons of messages coming back and forth. That was like a baddie time. That was just a baddie time. I just missed that one. But it recalled to our attention recently, and we're reaching out to that individual to figure out, what they know, what they don't know, or whatever. To the best of my knowledge, we haven't made contact with that person yet. Well, we've reached out to that person, but they haven't reached out back quite yet. That's all I know at this time. The second part of your question about some 11th hour white hat. So there's no known exploit to the system now that would delay us from relaunching Ethereum. At least Ethereum might be delayed because of a current TSS issue that's happening, where in the second round of TSS signing, there's like TSS happens in 8 rounds, and then the second round is just like it kind of fails. And so the team is looking into that issue now. That may cause a delay in restarting ETH. We'll make sure the system's healthy before we start, putting on additional load onto it, of course. But there's no exploit or anything like that I'm aware of that would cause us to delay Ethereum restart.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you for the question, FinBlue. DeFi Cafe, saw you hopped up here if you want to ask a question.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming back, Chad. Question regarding this security posture, both technical and more like organizational. So obviously you guys went through a pretty hard time. Could you kind of outline what the changes were from a security perspective to keep the chain safe, and kind of more importantly, how the culture changed within the engineering team to kind of avoid these things happening, like how the root cause was addressed, so to speak?
Yeah, sure. So the incidents we had a couple months ago were all focused around the Ethereum blockchain. It is the most riskiest one of all because it has arbitrary code execution, or they call it ACE. It allows you to manipulate transactions in all sorts of wacky and interesting ways, which doesn't make sense to me at all from a design perspective. But I digress on that. so there was a lot of changes made between then and now, from a coding perspective, from a procedures perspective, from a personnel perspective, from all sorts of different angles. I could probably spend an hour talking about this topic, to be honest with you. But the core of it is, and kind of the TLDR is, we had at least 3 or 4 different external audits of individuals and companies to audit the code. We had internal audits as well. We made some code changes to make the system more resilient to any potential, or not any, but a large casting net of any of potential exploits, where it shuts itself down if there's insolvency in the network, for example. So somebody sends in some fake assets, for example, that tricks the network to think it's real assets. The network would stop itself. The network now delays outbound transactions in a high throughput scenario. If there's like a lot of money coming through all of a sudden, it delays transactions up to an hour, which gives the community time to respond and stop the attack from ever actually executing. Those are probably big things. We actually created a new team within the in the community called THORChain, which is comprised of white hat hackers who've been around for a very long period of time in the DeFi space. There are numerous people in that team, and more being added. Actually, you actually have the guy that there's a Geth exploit, if you guys remember, like about a few weeks ago, that like I think it split the chain, if I'm not mistaken, on Ethereum. That guy is actually helping out the team and doing some fuzzy security audits of the code base in many different forms. So there's a lot of that happening just continuously. Like we had initially a bunch of things happen, then we're just, as we're pulling in more people from the white hat community to take a look and take a different angle look at how to potentially exploit the code. That was a big thing. A lot of people talk about we didn't have a bug bounty, which is not true. We always had a bug bounty. It just never was a formal, stated one. So we have a Mutify that's now handling the bug bounties on our behalf. We tried to do an insurance plan, but a protocol level insurance, but it became impractical as we talked to Title and Nexus Mutual. We actually thought about using the POL as actually the insurance, so that if the POL was there and it had all this money that it just sat there, that there was a way to burn the POL's LP units and then basically donating its funds to the pools to give the money back to the LPs. But I don't think that's going to happen at this point now, though. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that happen throughout the code base in many respects. I think that's probably the shortest form I could say of it.
Awesome.
And hey,
appreciate it.
I got looped in here for a quick sec. I raised my hand to say something. This is Gavin from the Nine Realms side, and we've been working with the core team for a while. But on the security side, I wanted to just show up and add a little color. So in terms of maturing, it's like in the July events, we had to mature the security posture of the network relatively quickly. And so what Son of Odin is sharing here is like is kind of the basics. And so like you've got the code side, and then you've got the organizational and how you handle things. And so the how you handle things, there's been a lot of groundwork that's been done behind the scenes over the last 3 months to set us up for what this restart actually is. And so just to share a little bit, some of the white hats who kind of created THORChain, and the idea is like, what is THORChain? Well, if you're building a centralized exchange from the inside out, you say like there's the core team that's writing code, but on any exchange you'd have a security team that's dedicated, that's looking at the code from a more adversarial perspective and not necessarily shipping the core stuff, which is where the THORChain team kind of emerged from. And that's spearheaded by 2 world-class white hatters. And these guys have been breaking networks on Ethereum DeFi, but also cross-chain DeFi in other networks for years, since before it was cool. And so they're particularly interested in kind of the surface area of this. And from our perspective on the THORChain side, it's like the way that security is handled in DeFi largely today can be massively improved, right? The audit process is one way, but there's some other approaches that we see people taking, right? You've got Sherlock and you've got a couple of other things, but with the surface area of THORChain, what we realize is we need an approach that is equally creative as the engineering endeavor that's taking place. And so THORChain winds up becoming this, like, the intention is this, creating this center of excellence for a bunch of the folks who have been looking for ways to get involved on the security side, but haven't necessarily had the way to engage. And so after July's events and exploits, as people were looking to like submit things, yeah, you've got the obvious things of like stand up and immunify bounty program. But one of the things that Son of Odin was kind of like running through was the fact that THORSec exists. It's what has allowed us to pull in some of these guys that have really been leaders in other networks. And so, like he was mentioning, specifically for the E3 start, what we've done is we've brought in another guy who is, he's responsible for some of the latest exploits in the Geth client, and he's specifically focused on fuzzing the hell out of a lot of the Solidity side. But his team, which is relatively hard to just like get interested in something, is now banging on the protocol a little bit. And so what we're starting to do is kind of create this unique security envelope around THORChain for the long haul, beyond just kind of like the typical processes. But yeah, anyways, that's a little bit more color there.
One thing to add though is that people should be aware that like just because we've made these very large changes and spent months and we brought in many people from the industry and all these things that Gavin was talking about, it doesn't necessarily mean that there are no exploits in the code. Obviously, it's always going to be unknown whether there are or are not more exploits in the code, right? And so even though we've had many audits from external vendors, hiring more teams and doing all these things, and like doesn't necessarily mean there are no exploits. It just means that we put a lot of energy and time into bring as many people as possible into the system to from a white hat perspective to find any possible exploits in the code and patch them and fix them as we find them. But I'm just saying that another exploit could exist. I'm not saying it does exist. I don't know of any that do exist that we should be terribly concerned about at the moment. But like there could be another exploit moving forward. Hopefully there's not, but we're doing the best we can.
Awesome. Thanks, Gav, for jumping up and adding that. I want to bring us back to out of this security questions to one that I saw pop up in the stage chat a few times. This is back on the synthetics question chat, and I think it's an interesting one. So basically the question was, in your synthetics example, what would happen if the price of Bitcoin went way up in relation to Rune and everyone withdraws from the LP? It feels like they would no longer be backed by sufficient value, but it's also possible I'm not fully understanding the concept. I saw a few variations on that question in the chat.
Yeah, if Bitcoin goes way up in value relative to Rune, effectively what would happen is the network would basically take more and more LP units that's required to back that synthetic asset, and so the LPers would be at a loss, effectively taking that particular loss. That would be a leverage impermanent loss happening, right? So as a LPer, you're taking on impermanent loss in any sense of it, and this synthetics feature is going to leverage that in one direction or the other. So it doesn't matter in which direction it happens. In one direction, you're going to have loss. In one direction, you're going to have gain. That's basically the simple answer to that question. But I think what we've noticed, at least in over a year of economic data, when we did some analysis of the chain activity, is that impermanent loss is impermanent loss, meaning it's not permanent. It just fluctuates as the price goes up and down of things. Rune specifically is actually a pretty good asset to use as a base asset because it tracks the market. It has a tendency to have like a kind of like an ETF like functionality to it, where its value grows and shrinks with the general market by tendency. That's especially true the more assets get locked up into the pools, and the more Rune is in the pools or security versus ones that are off the chain sitting in some kind of cold wallet. So in that scenario, they would still be backed as they need to be, right? But you would basically the LPers would experience that loss, whatever that loss might be.
Awesome. Thanks for answering that. I'm not seeing any. Here's another one that someone asked, Familiar Cow. Are there any plans to outwardly market THORChain after the release of Mainnet to educate the larger space? Or is the true bull case of THORChain in its subtlety in that it will be used in the back end of other networks, such as ShapeShift, Trust Wallet, the centralized exchanges, etc.?
Yeah, I don't know actually to answer this question. So there is no real quote unquote marketing team on the project or marketing individuals per se. I mean, yes, we have some people who do some social things for us and within the community and this kind of stuff, but there's no concerted effort from a marketing perspective to push it out there you know, start buying ads on, some crypto news site or anything of this nature, or paying off YouTubers to talk about it or something like this. Like that never happens. I don't think that'll change, to be honest with you. I don't see the really need to change. Bitcoin never really had that per se. I don't think THORChain really needs it either. The project will just grow on its own using word of mouth more than anything else. But I do think there's use cases to that question. There's use cases for both the user to use THORChain as well as exchanges, right? I mean, ShapeShift was the most famous and first ones to use THORChain from an enterprise perspective or commercial perspective. Wallets are already started the process to integrate with THORChain, allow swaps, cross-chain swaps, this kind of thing. We actually started conversations with another centralized exchange to basically rip out the back end and put in THORChain. That's probably gonna take months and months of conversation to happen, if that does happen. The natural thing to happen is both of these things will grow together. I don't see why it wouldn't, to be honest with you, because it's profitable for all entities involved. So I think the natural thing is that it will happen in all systems, just because in every way that you slice this pie, it's profitable for everybody involved. And so that the economics push in that direction. And as I once heard Elon Musk say, is like, show me the economics and I'll show you what will happen, right? And that makes sense to me as well. So because you can make money as an exchange, you can make money as a wallet, and you can make money as a trader, in all cases, people will just naturally use it because it's make some money. It's a good reason to adopt a network.
Yeah, I think the good news is that, DAOs like ShapeShift or other protocols or projects are going to be very interested. Like we do have a marketing and growth work stream at the ShapeShift DAO, and I'm sure once THORChain is at full mainnet, uncapped, we're going to really want to promote that, to others and to our community, because it'll be, one of the big value propositions, as it always has been, of ShapeShift. So I think THORChain will get those benefits.
Oh, absolutely. I think as other exchanges, it's like, imagine a hypothetical scenario where like a Coinbase says, hey, you can give us your Bitcoin, or like a BlockFi and say, hey, we'll give you your Bitcoin, we'll give you a yield on your Bitcoin. And in the back end, they're just using THORChain as the yield generator. Instead of using GBTC, is what BlockFi uses today, they just use THORChain to generate yield on their Bitcoin. They will effectively become advocates and just dump huge quantities of liquidity into the network because it makes them money and makes their users money as well, right? So you're right. I agree with you that Shape is one example, and other companies will start advocating for the project just because it becomes in line with their basic functionality, and they want to see it succeed.
Yeah, so we're getting near the end of time here. I want to be sensitive to that. Chad, do you have a hard stop at 4, or are you okay to go a few minutes over? It looks like we got some other questions in the queue.
Oh no, go ahead. I'm here for any question you guys got.
Well, I'm going to invite some others who haven't had a chance to speak yet. We'll go a few minutes over since there's so much interest in this topic, and then we'll get to the end.
You got to drop. Thank you, Chad. Cheers.
Welcome, Eric.
Yeah. All right, I just invited a few people to stage. If you see that, you should see the ability to accept that up at the top of your screen. I'll ask one other question that got posted in the stage while we wait in the stage chat. Someone, Acro, asks, with Synth Composites, LP token, Thor.usb stablecoin, other financial primitives, THORChain emerges as a powerful financial ecosystem. Are there any interesting third-party developments that go beyond utilization of THORChain APIs you would like to share with us?
Sure. So I haven't actually spoken about this publicly too much. I think we discussed it internally somewhat, and we haven't really quite arrived on a decision to do it or not to do it. But it is an interesting concept, and that is the ability to build smart contracts on top of a THORChain in a way that allow you to access that liquidity and do whatever you want to do, like perpetuals, for example, or whatever. I've actually always pushed away from smart contracts on THORChain because I feel like it would be replicating the Ethereum mistake of trying to put the whole world through one single pipeline, which obviously doesn't scale particularly well or make much sense from a design perspective, from an architecture perspective. But I would loosen a little bit on this idea in this case because what is unique to THORChain is that it is chain agnostic, right? So this smart contract I'm talking about doesn't have to exist on THORChain, it can exist on any blockchain. So it can be on Ethereum, it can be on Terra, it can be on Avalanche, it can be on anything. It doesn't actually matter. And so what ends up happening is you provide liquidity into THORChain, like put some Bitcoin in there or whatever, and then you own some liquidity units, and then you transfer those liquidity units to a smart contract on Ethereum or on Terra or on, Solidity, not Solidity, sorry, Solana. And then you have access to that smart contract, and then you can do whatever you got to do with that contract. And then when you're ready to exit, you tell the smart contract to send back your LP units to your, Bitcoin address or whatever it is, and then you walk away with more Bitcoin maybe, or depending upon how your trading did or whatever it is you were doing on that smart contract. So that actually makes it possible to build DeFi apps and additional protocols on top of THORChain without actually deploying anything to THORChain. And you don't need to convince developers to adopt this new thing of smart contracting. You can just tell developers, hey, Ethereum, Solidity people, you can build, your DeFi protocols on liquidity that is access to every asset in the industry, more or less, or at least the most important ones. That's a very provocative thing to say to a person, right? That's a very interesting thing to say. And so it becomes like, well, why would I build it on Ethereum only if I can build it on Ethereum, but pull in liquidity from Bitcoin, from Litecoin, and from Bitcoin Cash, and like the entire sphere, not just the ETH sphere. It becomes kind of a no-brainer, right? So that's an idea we've been kicking around, which we may do, but we'll see.
Yeah, very interesting. RGB, you had raised your hand for a question. You want to go ahead?
Thank you so much. Thanks, Chad. We really appreciate you guys setting this up. My question is around regulation. So THORChain is all about permissionless, no KYC DEX. Say I just want to run like a hypothetical scenario with you. Tomorrow, 2022, 2023, if you guys receive a letter from the higher up saying you must implement KYC to serve US customers or something like that, how do you see that progressing? Like, what would be the defense from THORChain? Like, would you not serve US customers, or how would that work? Just a hypothetical. I don't know if you want to answer that, but yeah.
Before you answer, Chad, I just want to clarify the question to make sure that Chad answers the right one. When you used the word we, oh no, sorry, so you used the word you guys. When you guys receive a letter, which you guys are you talking about specifically?
I guess it could be either the official Twitter account, or I don't know exactly how this works, but it could be Discord. So I guess you tell me, but I don't really know. I'm just trying to run through a scenario where maybe the node operators receive a DM, or I don't know how this exactly works, because there's no official THORChain organization. But I'm just trying to figure out how that would look like, or yeah, so my guess is as good as anybody's, I guess.
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer it a couple times from different perspectives. I'll try to be concise about it though. So if it comes to me personally, there's a difference between saying the words "I can't" and "I won't," right? It's a very big difference, at least from a legal perspective. So if the SEC comes to me and says, "Hey, implement KYC or don't serve U.S. customers," or something of this nature, my reply will be, I can't. Not that I won't, but I can't. Because even if I do codify what you're talking about, I can't implement it. I have to convince the community to adopt it, which I honestly don't think the community would adopt it, to be honest with you.
Right, yeah.
So they probably won't do it. Comedically enough, I was actually just talking to the guys over at Galaxy Digital last week, I think it was 2 weeks ago. And we were just kind of floating the idea. I don't know if this is actually going to happen or not, so don't go crazy like this. But I'm floating there. I'm actually creating a THORChain fork that is KYC'd because Galaxy Digital can't swap in pools because they don't know who's providing liquidity, and therefore that's not KYC'd. Therefore, it's they can't legally allowed to do so. And I just talking to them, I was like, well, you can just fork THORChain and create a new chain, and then just put a KYC layer on top of it all, which wouldn't be that hard from a technical perspective. And then then you can do what you want to do. So maybe that'll actually happen. Maybe it won't. Who knows? But if they want to serve the THORChain Twitter account, Similar to me, it has no power or control. If they want to do node operators individually, they have to know who they are, which we always encourage people to be anonymous on who they are for a good reason, this being one of those. They could possibly, if it's being hosted by a cloud provider like AWS, for example, the SEC could do some subpoenas to get records from AWS of what credit card
And
is
maybe
paying
also
what.
sorry,
Yeah.
and maybe also the DNS, right? Like the Thor swap and the domain names and stuff, because they're registered probably against someone.
Yeah, but like that's true. But it's not as big a deal as people think that it is, because people like apps like AsgardX and ThorSwap, they have desktop versions. And so I always tell people I prefer to use the desktop version or the web UIs for that reason, because the web UI can be turned off on me and the desktop app will never be turned off because I can just download it and I have access to it. And it doesn't matter what happens, like there's nobody in between at all that would cause it to, basically fail more or less, right? That's not entirely true now because technically Midgard is being hosted by the team at the current moment. That's not the long-term goal. It's just the interim thing. Anybody can run a Midgard who wants to run a Midgard. So you can just download it yourself and run it and whatever. It's not a big deal. But like getting away from web UIs and moving more towards desktop applications is a way to get around this potential threat, if you ask me. And you can, if the website that's hosting the app, the desktop app gets turned off, and you always have BitTorrent, right? Like you can just put up a BitTorrent, have a checksum on it to make sure that it's a legitimate version and not something that's gonna steal your private key and all that kind of stuff. It's not a malicious, binary, whatever. And then you can get it via BitTorrent if you wanted to. So there's always a way around that particular issue, from my perspective. But yeah, I mean, if the FCC comes after anybody, it's not going to be THORChain. THORChain's too small potato, especially now. Obviously, sushi is a bigger deal and a bigger thing to go after because they got like $1 billion a day of traffic or something like this. So, and THORChain's not anywhere close to that. So maybe one day that'll change, and when that does change, then it will be much further down the road, and it'll be much more centralized than it is now. Like we're going further and further towards decentralization as much as humanly possible with this design.
Nice. Thank you so much.
I'd like to add on, as terrible as it would be, I think that anybody and everybody should be obeying laws and should not try to ruffle the feathers of any authority that comes to you saying you must do something or else you will go to jail. If I'm running a website on a domain and the SEC says, shut down your domain, Michael, I'll shut it down. If any in the audience are running a Thor node and somebody comes and says, you better shut down this Thor node or you're going to jail, I would encourage that person to shut down their Thor node and not go to jail. But what we cannot control, what I cannot control, is what somebody else does with their time and their action. And just because one domain name may be seized or go down doesn't prevent somebody else from starting their own domain name and putting another one up. Just because one Thor node decides to shut down for whatever reason doesn't stop somebody else from choosing to put up a Thor node themselves. In this way, decentralization will always win.
Yeah, great point, Michael. And thank you for the question, RGB. I know we're a good bit 10 minutes over time here. I want to get to one final question that was posted in the stage chat, and then we'll probably call it a day. I don't want to waste too much, or not waste, but take too much of Chad's time. He was very generous with us. So an Anon person asked, what are more ways ShapeShift and THORChain can leverage each other besides a Fox room pool, which of course we would all love to see when ERC20s were back up. What can ShapeShift do to become the go-to THORChain wallet?
Sorry, is that a question for me or is that a question for you guys?
I mean, I've got ideas, but I think the question was for you. Do you have ideas on this?
Of how to get ShapeShift to be the THORChain wallet?
I think that was part of it, but also just what other ways can we leverage each other? What other ways can the THORChain and ShapeShift DAO communities work together? From your perspective.
Yeah, sure. So I know there's already some synergies already happening. I know Exchange.js, which is a JavaScript library to make UIs easier to build. I think there's already some talk about combining forces between the ShapeShift community and the THORChain community. Not having to duplicate efforts is like a big thing, right? And just having one quintessential library that is hardened and contributed by a large list of individuals, and that just creates a much healthier community. Yeah, I mean, we're even thinking about internally about like having even affiliate fees be able to be collected in any asset, including Fox tokens, which could help the Fox community out pretty well, because then your ShapeShift UI can take out some fees, like 10 basis points or whatever you want to do, and it basically just takes that 10 basis points and then swaps it into Fox token, and then sends that Fox token to some address, some smart contract maybe, where it can then be redistributed to the Fox community. And actually, so as people use the ShapeShift UI, it actually generates income for all the people who hold Fox token, which would be really cool concept. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be hard to become like the quintessential THORChain, wallet in a sense, because I think eventually almost every wallet will integrate, right? Like in most of them, you won't even know that you're using THORChain. This becomes like the obvious choice of, hey, how can I provide a really good service for my users, and at the same time provide revenue for myself as a wallet manufacturer? it becomes pretty like simple question to answer, But I don't think there will be, honestly, like a UI that is the UI. It'd be a common UI. Shape would be one of them, and THORSwap would be another one, and I think there's a new one coming out called DeFi Spot, I think, or something like this. Maybe even like MetaMask will integrate, and Trust Wallet will do so as well. They've already partially done it. So, any of these wallets, even Ledger's being actually some work being done to integrate with Ledger in that sense as well. So it's going to be hard to become like the definitive Thor UI, because almost everything will probably use it. At least in my opinion, that's true. At least that's my hope. That's my intention. And then it'll become this kind of like thing that is core essential to every UI out there.
Yeah, no, great points. And I wasn't aware. I knew that obviously, and for anyone in the community who didn't know, ShapeShift even today has the ability to turn on a affiliate fee to basically pay back to the DAO if it wanted to, although that would have to be voted in by governance. But that's really cool to know that we could actually choose to get that paid in whatever asset, including Fox token, would be very interesting.
Yeah, right now it's only Rune in this current moment, but we've talked internally about changing this so you can select which asset you want, and then every once in a while it just kind of sends you over some more Fox token or whatever token you're into.
Yeah, great. Well, I know
Baby
you and the
steps.
THORChain community know how big of a supporter ShapeShift and the ShapeShift DAO is of THORChain, and we'll continue to look for ways to collaborate and support each other. I know that there are some talks, like you mentioned, with Exchange.js and just general talks between some of the ShapeShift development and community member team with 9 Realms about various ways to collaborate and work on THORChain together. And I think some other ideas will probably pop up in the coming weeks and months. So we'll continue that discussion.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, Chad, I want to thank you for taking so much time with us. This has been a great call. We're definitely going to have you back sometime, maybe multiple times, because I don't think we'll ever get all the questions in that we want and all the discussion that we want. But I just really appreciate it. Michael, anything you want to say before we sign off for the day?
No, just thank you so much for taking the time. You said it. I learned a lot about some of the new features coming to THORChain, like THORFi and the synthetics. You've really did a great work at demystifying these new features, Chad. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no worries. And I want to thank the community. I want to thank the ShapeShift community. I want to thank the THORChain community for holding true and being continuing their support of the project despite these kind of difficult times in some sense. You guys are diamond hand individuals, and so I definitely appreciate that. I'm still here. You're still here. We're all pushing for the same goal. Nothing's changed from a fundamental perspective. It just, we had to divert our attention for a little while to focus on other things for a bit, but the goals are still there. The value is still there. The value proposition is still there. All that stuff. So I really want to thank the THORChain community and the ShapeShift community for holding true and keeping support, and looking forward to the next 6 months with you guys.
Awesome. Sounds great. And with that, I think we'll sign off for the day. Thanks again, Chad. And thank you, both ShapeShift and THORChain communities, for coming and joining this call and asking some really great questions. All right, all. Well, everyone have a great evening, and we will see you soon on the ShapeShift Discord.